Solomon Briggs was 38 years old when his wife ordered the most expensive wine on his restaurant's list to impress a man whose name Solomon had found in her phone 3 weeks earlier. He drove a 9-year-old Ford pickup with a dent in the passenger door that he had never gotten around to fixing. He wore the same dark canvas jacket to most places outside of work and kept his hair close and his opinions to himself at social events, which was why people who met him at Charlotte dinner parties generally assumed he was in construction or trades. Desiree's corporate friends called him Quiet Solomon, and he had let that stand because a man who spent energy correcting people's assumptions about him spent it in the wrong place. What Desiree had told Crawford Vance was that she knew all the best restaurants in Charlotte and that tonight she was taking him somewhere special. A farm-to-table place in South End she had discovered herself, with an extraordinary cellar and one of the finest tables she had ever sat at. What the ownership registration for Briggs Dining Group LLC showed, on public file with the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds, was that the restaurant, Ember and Stone, South End, Charlotte, 38 seats, 3 years of consecutive recognition in regional dining guides, belonged entirely to Solomon. What neither Desiree nor Crawford had any reason to consider was that the tasting note for the Pommard she ordered that evening, the $380 bottle she read aloud from the wine list, with the ease of someone presenting her own expertise, had been written in the first person by the man who sourced it, imported it, and put it in the cellar they were sitting 12 feet from. When Solomon walked through the dining room at 9:15, they were still on the first glass. He had already seen everything he needed to see. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Solomon did his best thinking in the hour before a kitchen woke up. He arrived at Ember and Stone most mornings by 9, when the prep cooks were still arriving and the dining room had the clean, settled quality of a space that had done its work and rested and was ready to do it again. He would walk the room first, checking the table settings, adjusting the candles on the server station, running his hand along the back of the wooden chairs he had sourced from a workshop in Asheville. Then the kitchen, where he would taste whatever was being prepped that morning and talk with his head chef about the evening's specials. The wine room was off the back of the dining room, behind a glass partition that let diners see the cellar without entering it. The cabinet against the far wall was cedar, a piece Solomon had built over 2 weekends in his home workshop, fitting the individual slots to the exact depth needed for the standard burgundy bottle and the occasional magnum he liked to have on reserve. He had stained it with a dark oil and mounted it himself. It held 62 bottles at any given time and was the thing he was most privately proud of in the whole restaurant. Not because anyone knew he'd made it, but because he did. His grandmother, Rose Briggs, had cooked for other people's households in Memphis for 34 years and had taught Solomon that the kitchen was the most honest room in any building. She had been dead 4 years. He heard her most clearly when he was in a kitchen alone, before the noise started. She used to say, "Solomon, the person who cooked the meal always knows what went into it. The person eating it only knows what it tasted like." He had taken that as a professional principle and eventually understood it was something larger than that. Ember and Stone had opened 3 years ago as the second restaurant in Briggs Dining Group. The first, a smaller, more casual place called the Woodyard in Noda, had been his proof of concept. Ember and Stone was what he had always actually wanted to build: 38 seats, sourced and seasonal. A wine program he managed himself. A kitchen that ran on the principle that preparation was the meal and everything else was just service. A second location, Briggs Table, was scheduled to open in Dilworth in the spring. Desiree called the restaurants his food projects, the way someone describes something they have learned not to ask about. He had met Desiree Fontenot at a Charlotte charity gala 8 years ago. She was in corporate marketing, sharp and composed, with the specific confidence of a woman who moved through rooms by design rather than by accident. She had been standing near the catering station when he delivered the amuse-bouche, and she had tasted one without ceremony and then turned to find him and said it was the best thing she'd eaten all year. He had been pleased that she'd noticed. He had asked if she wanted to know what was in it. She had said yes. They talked for 40 minutes. They married 2 years after that. The marriage had been warm and purposeful in the first years, and gradually less so, not in any single argument, but in the accumulation of small distances that go unnamed, because naming them feels premature until suddenly they do not. She had grown more interested in Charlotte's social orbit and the particular company of people whose careers were visible from a distance. She attended his restaurant openings as his wife and left without asking much about the food. He had noticed. He had continued to cook. On a Friday morning in October, Victor Mays knocked on the office door and said there was something Solomon should see before the weekend. Victor had been Ember & Stone's general manager since the opening, mid-50s, methodical, the kind of professional who kept notes on everything and had opinions about all of it and shared them only when asked, which was one of the reasons Solomon trusted him with the operation entirely. He set a printed service log on the desk. Last Saturday's service. Table 7. The server's notes for a party of 2 included one line Victor had underlined. Guest requested to know more about the wine program and described her husband as being in property investment. His name had not come up. The guest had presented a card for the check, Desiree Vance. Victor said, "I recognized her at the pass. I've met her twice at industry events as your wife. I didn't say anything during service." A pause. "I thought you should have the record." Solomon looked at the underlined line for a long moment. Then he said, "Pull me the last 6 months of Table 7. He sat at his desk in the back office with the full pause history spread in front of him and went through it with the same unhurried attention he brought to every cost analysis the restaurant produced. Table 7. 4 visits in 5 months. Always a Saturday. Always a party of 2. The reservation name each time. D. Vance. Not D. Briggs. The credit card on file. Desiree's MasterCard. A personal account separate from their joint household card. The bills ranged from $240 to $480. The most recent, $380 for the Pommard, 2 entrees. A shared dessert Solomon recognized as the hazelnut tart his chef had been running as a seasonal special. He had sourced that wine and written the tasting notes and imported the case and arranged it in the cellar he designed and the cabinet he built, and offered it to every guest who came through his door. And now, one of those guests had been his wife, and she had been reading his own words back to another man as if they were her discovery. He pulled up everything he could find on Crawford Vance, commercial real estate developer, based in Ballantyne. 41 years old. Drove a leased Porsche. Had a LinkedIn biography that described him as a visionary developer, which was a phrase Solomon had learned in the restaurant business usually meant the person in question was better at describing a project than completing one. His most recent development, a mixed-use building in Ballantyne, was 18 months behind schedule. 2 subcontractors had filed liens. He posted about wine on social media. 2 months prior, a photograph of a wine glass, the distinctive dark wood of Ember & Stone's wine room visible in the background, captioned, "My favorite table in Charlotte." She knows all the best places. Solomon looked at that photograph for a measured moment. His hands did not shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He exported the POS records and the server logs. He photographed the social media post. He pulled the 4 reservation records. He printed a clean timeline. 5 months, 4 visits, each one a Saturday when Desiree had told him she was at her sister's, or meeting colleagues, or simply out for the evening. He picked up his phone. He called Felicia Drummond. Then he called Victor. "Confirm the standing reservation for table 7 on Saturday," he said. "And make sure we have the Palmart stocked. I'll be coming in for service." Felicia Drummond had been practicing family and business law in Charlotte for 24 years, and she reviewed the table records and social media documentation without flinching, which was what Solomon had expected of her. "She's been charging joint account cards at your own restaurant," Felicia said. "Not all of them. The MasterCard account appears to be personal, but 2 of the 4 visits used the joint Visa. Combined with the dining charges at other locations I've been flagging, we're looking at approximately $3,100 in marital funds directed toward this relationship over 5 months. Marital waste," Solomon said. "Documented and recoverable." She set the records down. "I also want to tell you something about Crawford Vance. My associate ran a financial background at my request. The Ballantine project is in significant distress, the 2 lien filings are a matter of public record, and his operating lines of credit are stretched. The Porsche lease is current, but only just." She paused. "He presents well. The infrastructure doesn't match the presentation." Solomon said nothing. "There is one more thing," Felicia said. "Desiree has been meeting with a financial advisor named Preston Carroll for the past 3 months. Carroll and Vance are listed as co-investors in a 2021 LLC registered in South Carolina. The man advising your wife on her finances has a business relationship with the man she's been bringing to your restaurant." She let that settle. "She has been receiving guidance," Felicia said carefully, "from inside the other camp." He drove to the Dilworth neighborhood that Saturday afternoon before service, to a brick bungalow his uncle Thomas Briggs had owned for 12 years since moving up from Memphis. Thomas was 64, retired, and had run a soul food restaurant in South Memphis for 25 years before his knees and his doctor had a conversation that ended the matter. He knew more about the restaurant business than anyone Solomon had ever met, and he still talked about cooking the way other men talked about raising children, with a specific mixture of effort and love that made the subject inexhaustible. They sat on the back porch. Thomas listened to all of it without comments until Solomon was done. Then he said, "She ate at your restaurant, the one you built yourself, and she was there 4 times without knowing it was yours." "She knew I owned restaurants," Solomon said. "She just never asked which ones." Thomas turned his coffee mug in both hands and was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother had a line about that," he said. "About people who ate the food without knowing the cook." Solomon waited. "She said the meal always told you something about the person who made it. I used to think she meant the cook's character was in the food." He set down his mug. "But she also meant it the other way. What you're willing to eat without knowing where it came from, that says something too." He looked at Solomon steadily. "She was eating your food and ignoring the cook," he said. "For years." By Thursday of the following week, Felicia's associate had completed the financial review on Crawford Vance that confirmed and exceeded what the surface picture had suggested. The Ballantine project's cost overruns now stood at $2 million against an original budget of $4.1 million. The 2 lien filings were from subcontractors he had stopped paying 7 months prior. A third subcontractor had sent a formal demand letter that had not yet become a filing. His personal credit lines were being serviced at minimum payments. He owed $14,000 to a Charlotte country club in unpaid dues. He had posted about wine and fine dining 12 times on social media in the past year. Felicia's associate had cross-referenced each post with industry tasting guides and found 6 terminology errors significant enough that a trained palate would have caught them immediately. He described the Palmart in the post from 2 months ago as having earthy tobacco notes, which was a description Solomon would have corrected at the table. Palmart was known for red fruit and iron, and sometimes a floral quality, but not for tobacco, which belonged to an entirely different grape profile and region. He had been performing expertise he did not have. He had been doing it at Solomon's restaurant, eating Solomon's food, drinking Solomon's wine, and presenting all of it as a discovery Desiree had made. Preparation was the meal. Everything else was just service. Solomon went home Friday evening, changed out of his kitchen clothes, and cooked dinner. Desiree came in at 7:30 and asked what he was making. He said lamb chops and roasted fennel. She said that sounded good. She set the table. They ate. She talked about a campaign she was developing for a new client in the banking sector. He asked 2 questions and listened to the answers. She mentioned she had dinner plans on Saturday, catching up with a colleague she had been meaning to see. He nodded. He passed the bread. She had no idea. He washed the dishes and went to his workshop for an hour. He was working on a second cedar cabinet for the wine room at Briggs' table, the same design as the Ember and Stone piece, adjusted for the new space's dimensions. He fitted the first shelf runner into its dado joint and checked it with a square. It was exactly right. Some things you built without knowing how thoroughly they would outlast everything around them. Ember and Stone ran a full house on Saturday evening. Solomon was at the pass by 5 o'clock, reviewing the prep with his head chef and signing off on the evening specials: a duck confit with charred citrus, a vegetable tasting plate built around late-season root vegetables, the hazelnut tart on its 3rd week and still moving well. The kitchen was in its pre-service calm. Every station organized, every mise en place in its place, the sound of the ventilation system and the distant clatter of the prep team settling into the rhythm that preceded the real work. At 6:45, Victor came back and confirmed, Table 7, party of 2. D. Vance, 7:30 reservation. They arrived at 7:28. Victor seated them. At 8:50, the Palmart was ordered. At 9:15, Solomon took off his kitchen whites and put on his dark blazer from the hook by the office door. He picked up his copy of the evening's wine list. He walked out through the kitchen pass and into the dining room. The restaurant was full and warm, the sound of service moving through it the way it always moved on a Saturday, the quiet percussion of crystal and conversation, the particular light that made a room feel the way he had always wanted that room to feel. He had designed that light. He had spent 3 weeks on it. Crawford was leaning toward Desiree across the table with the posture of a man performing attention. Desiree had her second glass of the Palmart and was describing something with her hand in the air. She looked the way a woman looked when she believed the room was hers. She looked up when Solomon reached the table. The story she had been telling stopped in her mouth. Crawford turned and looked at the man standing at their table in a dark blazer, unhurried, holding a wine list. He saw someone he did not recognize. He looked at Victor, who had materialized at Solomon's shoulder with the composed patience of a general manager who had anticipated this moment and had nothing to prove in it. "I hope the evening is going well," Solomon said, to the table in general, in the voice he used when he was tasting someone else's food and had already formed a complete opinion and was waiting for the right moment to offer it. Crawford said, "It's been excellent. The wine especially. I'm glad to hear it." Solomon opened the wine list to the Palmart page and set it on the table, the tasting note facing Crawford. The note there, the one that reads, "We discovered this at a small family domain in Palmart in the autumn of 2022, and we have not stopped thinking about it since." I wrote that. I was there when we first tasted it. Crawford looked at the note. We, he said. My wife and I were traveling in Burgundy 2 years ago. Solomon looked at Desiree. She was very still. She was standing next to me when I tasted it for the first time. I imported it for this restaurant. He paused. My restaurant. Victor placed the Briggs Dining Group ownership registration on the edge of the table. 1 page. Clean. The notary stamp visible at the bottom. Crawford looked at the document. He looked at the wine room through the glass partition, the cedar cabinet against the far wall, the bottles in their slots, the quality of a cellar that had been assembled by someone who knew exactly what he was building. He looked at Victor. He looked at Solomon. He said, "This doesn't need to become anything more than. It already is what it is," Solomon said, without heat. He was looking at Desiree. "You told him you discovered this place, that you knew all the best tables." He set the wine list down between them. "The tasting notes you read to him the first time you were here, I wrote those. I spent 3 weeks sourcing that wine. The cabinet in the wine room, the one you told him was beautiful, I built it. The menu you described as inspired, I worked on it for a full season." He looked around the room once, slowly, taking it in the way a man looked at something he had made and kept for years. "This room, Desiree. You brought him into this room." Desiree said his name, just the 1 syllable. He did not answer it. "Felicia will be in touch by Monday." He looked at Crawford one final time, without hostility, with the particular dispassion of a man who has tasted something and identified it precisely and has no further interest in the subject. "Finish the Pommard," he said. "It was a good choice." He turned and walked back through the dining room toward the kitchen. At table 9, near the window, Felicia Drummond was finishing her duck confit and speaking quietly with her colleague, and did not look up from the conversation. She did not need to. Solomon pushed through the kitchen door. The kitchen received him the way kitchens always received him, with work, with the familiar smell of the evening's cooking, with the immediate and specific demands of service in motion. He put on his whites. He returned to the pass. There was a dish to check and a sauce to taste, and a server waiting for his sign-off on a late addition to the tasting menu. He gave it his full attention. Behind him, in the dining room, a woman sat at a table he had built, and drank wine he had found, and was surrounded by things she had never bothered to understand. He did not think about it again that evening. 8 months later, Solomon was at the pass at Briggs' table on a Tuesday morning in late spring. The Dilworth restaurant had opened in March, 44 seats, a slightly more casual format than Ember and Stone, but the same sourcing philosophy, the same approach to the wine program, the same cedar cabinet against the back wall of the cellar, the second one, the one he had built in his workshop on the Friday night before the reckoning. Victor Mays had moved over to run it full-time. Solomon split his days between the 2 locations and had started sketching concepts for a third. The divorce had been finalized 10 weeks prior. Felicia's preparation had been thorough, and the documentation had been comprehensive. The marital waste claim had been established with the post records, the credit card cross-references, and the 5-month timeline. The financial connection between Crawford Vance and Desiree's personal advisor had been entered into evidence. The Briggs Dining Group structure had been reviewed. The original restaurant predated the marriage entirely, and Ember and Stone, while open during the marriage, had been funded through the business entity's operating capital rather than marital funds. The equitable distribution outcome had reflected the actual record of the marriage. Crawford Vance's Ballantine development had gone further into difficulty. The third subcontractor had filed. His credit facility had been restructured. He had listed the Porsche privately in the spring and moved to Raleigh in a quieter fashion than he had arrived in Charlotte. Desiree was working as a freelance marketing consultant, a smaller and more independent practice than the corporate position she had left. Her Charlotte social circle had contracted in the way social circles contracted when the full story was known to the people inside it. She had called Solomon once, 4 months after the restaurant, from a number he did not recognize. He had not answered. There was a woman named Celeste in his life now. She wrote about food for a regional publication and had come into Ember and Stone 6 months ago on an assignment, ordered the full tasting menu, and spent 2 hours afterward asking him questions about sourcing and technique and philosophy that were more specific and more interesting than any questions a writer had ever asked him. She had come back 3 weeks later. Not on assignment. She had brought nothing with her except an appetite and an opinion about what the seasonal menu was doing right and what it was holding back on. He had liked her immediately and told her so at the end of the second visit. She tasted things carefully. She paid attention to what was in them. On a Tuesday morning in late May, Solomon stood at the Briggs table pass with his coffee going cool beside him and tasted the sauce his chef was developing for the summer menu. A reduction built on cherries and red wine. Still not quite right. Something in the balance needing adjustment. He told the chef what he thought. They discussed it for 12 minutes. They adjusted the acid. They tasted it again. It was closer. He set down his spoon and looked at the kitchen. His kitchen, built from his plans, stocked with his choices, running on principles he had been refining for 15 years. And he felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. The person who cooked the meal always knew what went into it. His grandmother had told him that his whole life. He had only recently understood how many ways it was true. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.